If you're doing permissions like this, where you're checking a user's role, then you are doing permissions wrong. In this masterclass, I'm going to be going over every single style of permission system out there, from something that's incredibly simple and will work for many applications, all the way up to enterprise level permission systems that many companies charge thousands of dollars for, and then you could build something like a Google Drive clone with. And I'm going to be doing all of this by going over multiple different diagrams, showing you exactly how all these different things interact, and going through code demonstrations all the way through the simple to the extreme level of permission systems, so that way you know how to use any permission system for your exact application. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And the very first thing that we're going to dive into is why this role-based way of doing permissions is not ideal and how it can quickly snowball into a terrible piece of code and hard to maintain. But before we do that, I first want to mention a huge thank you to Clerk. Clerk is actually the sponsor of this video. They're a really great authentication company. I use them in a lot of my different projects that I've built. And I'm going to show you how you can actually integrate all of these permission systems into Clerk if you want to. You don't have to use Clerk to use these permission systems. They're all going to be built outside of Clerk, but then I'm going to show you how to integrate them into Clerk just to show you how it makes a lot of these things even easier to do. So the very first thing, like I mentioned, I want to talk about why this role-based system is not ideal. So really quickly, I have some very basic code over here where I just have a comment on a page. And if you're an admin user, you have the ability to delete this comment. Really straightforward. And if I change the role of my user up here to admin, you can see on the right-hand side, the delete button shows up for this comment. That's relatively straightforward. But what happens if I want to add in a new role? For example, a moderator role. Well, a moderator should probably have the ability to delete comments too. So now I need to add another check in here to see if the user role is equal to moderator. And if that is true, or if their role is admin, then the delete button should show up. So now it doesn't matter which of those two roles they have, they can delete this. But now I also probably want users to be able to delete their own comment. So I'm going to come in here with another or check. So I can say user.id is equal to like the author ID. So we'll say author ID, and we'll just come up here, const author ID is equal to 1. Just imagine that's like the ID of the actual comment itself. So now you can see that I'm a user that created this comment, but if I'm a different user that did not create the comment, you can now see I cannot delete it. And very quickly, you can see how this easily spirals out of control, because now I have multiple levels of if checks all joined together with ors and ands to make this really complicated giant query. And now if I need to change any of the permissions, for example, I want to change what my moderator can do so that they can no longer delete these things, I need to come to every single place I added this if check, and I need to change that. So it's incredibly difficult to add and modify permissions, and every single time you want to modify the permission of some user or role, I need to go into my actual code and change it, instead of going into like a configuration file or a specific permissions file. So my permissions and all of the stuff related to them is kind of littered throughout my entire code base. So the very first permission system that we can move to move away from this role-based system is actually called role-based access control, RBAC. And it may sound like everything's related to roles, but instead we're switching over to a permission-based mindset. So here I have a really quick authentication file that's actually going to do all of these different permission handlings for us. So for example, here you can see I just have an object with all of my roles and all of the different permissions they have. And generally in these permission-based systems, what you're going to do is you're going to break down each thing that someone can do into two parts. It's going to be the action, for example, view, create, update, delete, and then it's going to be the resource, the thing that you're acting on. For example, like comments, to-do, products, blogs, articles, whatever are the things in your database that you want to act on, that's going to be your resource. And then the action is going to be the thing you want to do on that particular object. Generally, when you're writing these systems, you'll separate them by a colon. This is a pretty standard practice. So as you can see here, all of the different permissions that my admin, moderator, and user can have are all defined in this one particular location. Now, if you wanted, you could move these into a database or store them wherever you want. I'll even show you in my diagrams how you would store some of these inside of a database. But for our particular use cases, to keep everything as simple as possible, I'm just going to be storing everything directly in the code. Now, the reason this is so much nicer is because it takes all of these complicated if checks to see what a user can do and what they can't do based on their role, and it confines it all to this one configuration object. And now I can just call this function called has permission. All it does is it takes in a user and it takes in a permission. For example, view comments, create comments, update comments, whatever it is that I want to do. And it's going to check that permission on the user's role to see if it has that particular permission. So all it's going to do is it's going to take the user's role, it's going to get the role from this configuration right here, and it's going to check, hey, does that permission exist inside of it? That's all it's going to do. So I can replace all of this code right here, and I can just say has permission, and I can pass it in my user, and I can pass it in what I want to do. So in our case, this is going to be for deleting some comments, just like that. Now I'm getting a typing error specifically because my stuff doesn't line up with all the things that it expects. You can see here it expects an ID of a string and a role, which is one of these roles, admin, moderator, or user. So I'm just going to get this type of role. I'm going to come into here and I'm going to manually type this to say it's an ID, which is a string, or a role, which is a role. Make sure we get that being imported. There we go. Give that a quick save. Make sure I actually export it from here first. There we go. And then we're going to import that from the correct file. And there we go. That should all work fine. So now if I have the ability, for example, as an admin or as a moderator to delete this, you can see it's going to work just fine. And it gives me the permission to actually delete that particular thing. Now, again, the thing that makes this really nice is, let's say in the future, I decide, you know what, moderators cannot actually delete these. All I have to do is come into this one file, remove the ability for moderators to delete, and now every other location in my code is going to work fine. So if I, for example, had a UI that showed a button, I had a server action that deleted something from my database, and I had some other place in my code where something could be deleted for a comment, I now do not need to change all of those locations. The old way I was doing things, I would have to go to each place where I deleted a comment and update the particular permissions to say, okay, now remove this moderator check. But now instead, I just change it in one particular location. Now everywhere else that is checking for deleting comments, the moderators no longer have permission to do that. Now you will immediately notice there's some limitations with this system that we didn't have with the other system though. And the main limitation is that it's very difficult for us to do any type of roles based on particular attributes of our objects that we're checking. So for example, originally I said that a user that was the same ID as the author ID was able to delete this. So if I change this back to user and I make sure the ID of the user is the same as the author ID, in my old system, I was able to do this delete. But right now in my new system, I no longer have that ability. So there's a few ways to get around this. The main way, if you have a rather simple use case where really all you're doing is checking can they delete their own thing, is you can add in a new permission called own delete or own whatever. So for example, here we can say own delete, or I'm sorry, delete, and we want to delete our own comments. There we go. So we can say we can delete anything as long as it's our own comments. And same thing here, we can do an update for our own comments. There we go. And we can do the same thing for our moderator up here to say, for example, that they can delete their own comments and so on. But we'll say that they can delete any comments and they can update only the ones that they own, just like that. So now I can actually do a check here where I can say, okay, can they delete the comments? Sure. Or do they have their permission to delete their own? So user, and this is going to be for deleting their own comments. And here we need to just make sure that the check is here, the user.id is equal to the author ID. Let me get my parentheses all set up in place and we can take a look at this final code here. And now we're first checking, do they have permission to delete any comments, or do they have permission to delete their own comment? And is this particular comment their own comment? Now, even with all of these changes, you can see that this system still has quite a lot of code that you need to write to check the permission, especially when we're dealing with can they delete their own comments. And if we were to add even more stipulations like, okay, you can only delete things that don't have particular statuses. So imagine like a blog article, once it goes to a published status, you can now no longer delete or update it. So that's another check that you need to add in, which requires you to add more permissions. And as you can see, the system very quickly spirals out of control. It works great for relatively simple systems, but as soon as you get more complex, it becomes very limited. And that's where kind of the final permission system I want to talk about comes in. But before we dive into that, it's a rather complicated system. We first need to understand a lot of other things related to permissions. So I want to go over a lot of those diagrams that I talked about. And I also want to show you how you can implement this inside of Clerk, because right now we're just hard coding all of our user objects and so on, which is not ideal. So I want to show you how to implement this with actual user objects so you can see this in a more real world scenario. So the very first thing we need to do is just to get Clerk set up inside of our application. I've already done that, but I'll show you what you need to do. The very first thing you'll need to do is install the Clerk Next package, because I'm in Next.js, but if you're not in Next.js, you can do whatever you want, install whatever Clerk package you need. But for Next.js, we'll just install the Clerk Next.js package. Then what you need to do is you need to wrap your entire application in this Clerk provider right here, which will make sure it provides all the different user authentication stuff you need. You need to take all your environment variables. You're going to need to copy them into your own env file here. And then you're also going to want to set up a webhook. So inside of our APIs here, we have a webhook. A lot of this code is directly from the documentation, but essentially all we're doing is we're taking in a webhook that every single time that we have the user created event being fired. Pretty much all this code up here is just getting all the information from our webhook and ensuring it's coming from Clerk. And then down here, we're doing our actual code. So we're just checking whenever a user is created, we're making sure to update their role to have a role of user. So let's just come in here and say their role is going to be user, just like that. Now this is going to be setting information on their public metadata, which is nice because now we can use this role anywhere, whether we're on the client, on the server, it really doesn't matter. We'll have access to the role directly on the user object. Now the final thing you need to add into your application to make sure that Clerk is working is just your middleware file. This is directly copied from the Clerk documentation. As you can see here, this is the Clerk documentation going over everything you need to do. And as you can see, we install Clerk, get the env variables, get our middleware, wrap everything in the provider, and that's literally it. We're entirely done. So rather straightforward. Once we have that done, we can actually use Clerk in our application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a really simple sign in and sign up button. So I'm just going to paste this particular section in. We're going to add in this signed out component as well as this sign in button. There we go. Now this will give us a button at the top of our page that allows us to sign in or to sign out. And as you can see, that button is showing up because we are currently signed out. Now, if we click this sign in button, we can go through the process of signing in. You can see I can continue with GitHub and say that I want to authorize Clerk to be able to use my GitHub account. And now we're actually signed in. As you can see, that button has disappeared. And if I wanted, I could get, for example, my user ID by just saying I want to await calling the auth function from Clerk. And I can just put that user ID anywhere inside of my page. And now you can see my user ID is showing up. What I want to do is I want to get that role that's on my public metadata. And the easiest way to do that is to add that metadata directly to my token that is being issued to my user. So where I'm getting this user ID, there's this thing called session claims. And this is all the information related to my JWT token. Now I want to add in my particular role. So what I need to do is go back to the Clerk page, and inside of my configuration for my actual project, I need to go down to sessions, and here I can customize my session token by adding any information in I want. So if I click on edit, you can see here I've already done this where I added a brand new role property, and this role property is going to get either my public metadata role, which if you remember correctly, we set inside of our VS Code, or it's going to default to a user role if it has not been set yet. So here it's just going to pull from my metadata, or they're going to get the role of user by default. Now, if we go back into our code, we look at that webhook, you remember I set my role to user right here, but I could set it to whatever I want, and we can go ahead and modify that later to show what that's going to look like. But now if I have that session claims, I can actually use that inside of here, session claims dot. And you can see I get dot role. Now the reason role is showing up for me in particular is because I added a particular type file right here that adds that to my types for Clerk. This is just if you're using TypeScript, you're going to want to add the particular type inside of here so you get autocomplete and so on. So now I have my actual role, and I can print that out like inside of an H1 or something. There we go. Now at the very top of my page, you can see my role shows up, which is user. Now, if I want to, I can manually update that user's role for testing purposes. So I can find that particular user, go down to their public metadata, click edit, and let's change their role to admin here. And this shouldn't be in an array. This should just be a normal role, just like that. So we'll give it a quick save. We'll come back over here, refresh our page, and we should see that once we get that a refresh, our role is now changed to admin. So we're able to easily get the role inside of Clerk. And now all we need to do is just plug that directly into our function here. So we can essentially get rid of this entire user section right here. We no longer need any of that. And now we can just use our user down here. So we can pass in whatever we want as our user. I'll give it an object here. So I'll just say const user equals. I can get my user ID just like that. So I can say my ID is my user ID. And my role is session claims.role, just like that. And technically this session claims is nullable. So we'll just come in here and say if user ID is equal to null, or if session claims is equal to null, that essentially means that we're not signed in. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the code for this button. I'm just going to move it up to here. There we go. So I'm just going to return my sign in button if I'm not signed in. I can get rid of all that content down there. And now my user is going to have a guaranteed ID and a guaranteed role inside of it. So now we can see I have an admin role, I have my comment, and so on. Now we are getting an error in our code because you can see that button is not showing up. That's just because my if check down here is incorrect, which is again, another reason why this system starts to fall apart as you get more complex. That's why I'm going to show you a more foolproof permission system in just a bit. But here we have our check if we have permission to do this, or if we have permission to do this particular thing. So I just need to make sure that I essentially wrap this entire top section inside of parentheses, just like that. Then if we just add one more parentheses right there, delete the parentheses down there, give that a quick save, and we refresh, we see that should work just fine now. So if we're an admin user, we again have the ability to delete this. If I were to come over here and change my user back to a user, a non-admin user, give that a quick save, and we'll make sure that the user ID is obviously different than this author ID. They should no longer have the ability to delete, and as you can see, that delete button has gone away. So we fully synced up our authentication system with Clerk into this particular authentication system, and going forward, it's going to be very easy to continue to do that integration. Now, the next thing I want to do is move over to all those diagrams I talked about. So each one of these different diagrams is really more so built around doing this inside of a database. So as you can see, the very simple idea that I had at the beginning was you have a user and that user has a role. Now, this is generally not good enough. So what we want to do is we want to move on from that to having multiple roles on a user. This is something we haven't even implemented yet, but almost every authentication system you build should probably have multiple roles per user. Even if you never assign more than one role per user, having the ability to do that makes it so your system is more flexible and the extra code you need to write is very minimal. So here we have a system that is built around having multiple roles for a particular user. So we have a user and we have a role. And in this particular diagram, every single blue thing that you see here is like a normal table. So we have a user table and a role table, and all these green tables are like a join table in a database. So one user can have multiple roles and one role can have multiple users. So it's a many-to-many relationship. Now, this will only take you so far though, because a lot of times you have to deal with more things, which are the permissions that we talked about. So if you're doing this with a database style system, you can see in your database, you have a permissions table, and every role can have multiple permissions, and every permission can have multiple roles assigned to it. Now, we wrote our system inside of code, which makes this particular section a little bit easier. But again, you can store it in a database in code however you want. And this is pretty much where our permission system is currently at, which works great for a lot of use cases, but as you saw, it is quite limited. Now, if we move on to the next level of permission system, you can see the only thing we added in is an organization. Pretty much if you're building any team-based application, think like Slack, or maybe you're building like a multi-tenant application, again, something like Slack, any application where users can be signed into multiple different organizations, you're going to need to have this organization table. And adding this in is actually not too terribly complicated on the data side of things, because all you do is you add in the organization to the role. So a user can have multiple roles, and each one of those roles is associated with a particular organization. So for example, if you're in organization A and in organization B, you may have like an admin role in one organization while you have a user role in a different organization, and you can use one account to sign in, and you're able to access all those different organizations by switching which organization you're signed into currently. This is a really foolproof system for that type of organizations. Now, it's a lot more complicated than this diagram makes it look, and Clerk actually makes organization handling incredibly easy. I'll show you how that works in just a bit. The next level of permissions gets drastically more complicated, as you can see. This is the final version on this diagram that I'm going to show you. Everything in the top section is entirely exactly the same, but what happens if you want to have something like a Google Drive system? Because on Google Drive, you can share documents with people, you can share folders with people, you can share things with other people. So essentially, you have a role for your entire organization, like I am a user, or I am an admin, or maybe I have multiple roles, like I'm a sales rep and I'm a tech lead. I have all these different roles for my organization. But I also have roles for individual resources in that organization as well. For example, if someone shares a file with me in Google Drive, I may have the editor role on that file, I have a viewer role on a different file, and maybe I have an owner role on another entirely separate file. So this system is incredibly complicated to do all those different connections. The best way to model it is something like this, where if you have just one particular thing you're sharing, for example, let's say you have a blog site and the only thing in your entire site that can be shared to multiple users is a blog. Well, then you can kind of hard code this, where you have another join table here that joins together all your users, the blogs that they have access to, as well as the roles. So this role system right here is almost identical to this organization system up here, but instead this is giving us particular roles to access individual resources instead of roles inside of an entire organization. Same thing here, we're connecting all of our roles to our permissions, and we use the exact same permissions between them. That is all right, it's going to work just fine. But now you can see here, I'm able to give users particular permissions to individual resources inside of my system. Now this starts to fall apart though when you have multiple different things that you need to share. For example, what happens if you have blogs and you have files and you have images and all these other things you need to share? Well, you could just copy this, paste it down, copy it, paste it down again, copy it, paste it down, and do this for every different type of resource you have. But as you can see, this becomes a mess rather quickly. So usually what ends up happening is you make this essentially a generic table, and all you do is you make it so that inside this user roles section, it'll say something along the lines of what type of thing. So it's like type equals blog, type equals file, type equals whatever. This is a rather complicated role-based system, and I'm going to show you how we can implement this in an even easier way instead of having to use this full-on table system to do everything, and that is by using something called attribute-based access control, ABAC. And the whole idea behind attribute access control is that we're going to have 4 different parts of every single check that we make. We're going to have very first the subject. This is almost always going to be the user object. This is the thing trying to do whatever permission we're asking of it. So we have a particular subject that says, I want to do something. We then have the action, which is the thing they want to do, like delete, update, read, view, whatever it is. Then we finally have the resource they want to do this on. So this is going to be like, I want to read all of the comments. I want to read these particular comments. I want to delete this one individual comment. That's exactly what the resource is. It is what is the thing you are acting upon. And then finally, the 4th section is going to be any other additional information. What organization are they a part of? What environment are they? Are they in like a particular location? Are they on a phone? All these different attributes that you can use to determine how you want this particular thing to come out. So as you can see, this looks very similar to our role-based access control, but the big difference is that every single one of these sections has a bunch of attributes on it. For example, our subject, our user, has a user ID, they have a particular role, maybe they have like a created at date, all these other things. Our resource has other things on it. Maybe it has an author ID that we want to check. It has like a published date that we want to check. It has a bunch of other things like, is this a draft? Is it not a draft? All these things that we can check inside of our permission to determine if we want to be able to do this particular action. This is the system that we're going to be building because this is by far the most flexible system, and this is the system that a lot of permission companies are going to charge you thousands of dollars to use. I'm going to show you how to build it entirely for free. So let's go back into our code, and before we jump into actually handling this permission systems, I first want to talk about some of the simpler ones, which is how we handle organizations and how we handle multiple roles instead of just users having one individual role. Now, when it comes to handling organizations, Clerk has all of that built in, which is incredibly nice. You can even see that I have this entire organizations tab right here. But what I can do is in the configure section, I can set up all my different organization settings, in particular my roles and my permissions. For example, I can have an admin role, a moderator role, a user role, and any other roles that I want. And I can also specify all the different permissions. So we're dealing with comments here. So I have a delete comments permission, a read comments and update comments, and a view comments permission. And I can add all the other permission related stuff that I want to have inside of here. And also a really nice thing about Clerk is they add in a bunch of their own permissions by default. And these are permissions specifically related to how organizations are handled. Can users create organizations? Can they add users? Can they invite users? Can they delete users? Can they update users? All the stuff related to actually managing your organization is built directly into here, which is really nice. So you don't have to worry about all of that stuff because it's honestly a lot more complicated than you think, especially when you start dealing with inviting users, users signing into multiple different organizations at the same time and swapping between them. All of that is handled automatically for you by Clerk, and it just works out of the box. All you have to do is just make sure that you enable organizations right here. There's just a checkbox and you just turn it on and boom, now you have organizations inside of your application. Now, if we want to deal with multiple roles, this is also incredibly easy for us to do. What we can do is we can come into our particular user. This is going to be going back from non-organization way of doing things. And I can just change this from role to roles, and then I can change this to an array, and there we go. That's going to work just fine. Now, also, I would need to modify my code to support that. So here, this would say roles, and it's going to be a role array. And also inside of here, I would want to change this to role and make this an array where by default, the only role this user has is the user role. Then I would need to modify my code even further. Here, this would say all of my different roles. And here where we check our has permission, this is again going to need to change because this is going to take in an array of different roles. So we just want to loop through those. So we can say return user.roles. Make sure I spell that properly. It's going to be roles. There we go. Dot sum. And for each one of my roles, I just want to return calling this particular code right there. And we're going to just pass in the role. Make sure I wrap all this in the correct parentheses. There we go. And I need one more parenthesis right there. Give that a quick save. That's all working just fine. Now the final step is in my page here. I just want to make sure that my user has a roles property instead of a role property. Give that a save. And then we'll just want to make sure that this is also updated to roles. And then we also need to configure our session here to make sure we pass along a roles and roles just like that, just because we renamed everything to roles from role. If you set this up originally the first time though, you don't have to go through all that renaming. Now with all that done, we should just hopefully be able to refresh our page. And as you can see, we get our roles at the very top there. And if we gave our user multiple roles, we would see those multiple roles at the top there. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go over to our particular user. We'll edit this and we'll add in a second role of admin. give that a save. And now if we come back over here, give it a second and refresh, a little bit more, there you go. Now we can see both of our rules are popping up right there. Now here is where we're going to go ahead and actually implement the incredibly complicated auth system I talked about at the beginning of the video. Let's just go ahead and we're going to paste in the entire file for this. And I'll go over all of the code inside of here because it's rather complex. So the very first thing that we have is a bunch of different types. This is to emulate all the different types inside of our data. So we have a to-do, we have a comment, we have a user, and we have a role. And if we look at those types, you can see a comment has an ID, a body, an author ID, and a created at. And here for our completed, we have a completed field, a user ID, title ID, and we even have an array of all the different users we have invited to access this particular to-do. So this particular set of data is going to allow us to do a lot of things. First, we can check, hey, is this the author of a comment? Is this the person that created the to-do? We can check, have they been invited to actually access this particular piece of data? We can check, is this to-do completed? All of these things we can use inside of our system. Also for our role, you can see we have admin, moderator, user just like before, but for our user, I added in an extra field for blocked by, so we can actually block particular users to, again, do all of these different complicated authentication and permission-based things. We can do permissions based on, are they invited? Are they blocked? Are things completed? Are they the author of this particular thing? All of this is handled by the system incredibly easily. So back to the auth section, at the top here, I just have some rather complicated TypeScript. The only thing that this TypeScript right here is doing is making it so that down here, when we define all of the different roles that we have, we get full type safety. So for example, if I delete some of this stuff and I come into here, you can see I get type safety for my comments. Inside of here, I can get create, update, or view. When I go to define this create, update, or view, I can either pass it a Boolean such as true or false, or I could pass it a function. And this function also has full type safety. For example, if I come into here and I access my user, I get all the user type safety. If I access my comment, I get all the comment type safety. So that's all that this particular set of TypeScript at the top is doing. Let me just bring this code back to how it was before. So don't even really worry about this. It's just some complicated TypeScript to do all of that. It's probably not even written that well because I'm really not that great at TypeScript. The next thing we have is this type right here called permissions. And this is where you define all the different permissions inside of your application. So for example, the very first permission we have is for comments. And the way I broke this out is the key here is the resource. So inside that 4-step system, I mentioned the resource. So here's our resource, our comments. Then I specify what the type of the comment is. This is again only for TypeScript, so TypeScript can give me nice autocomplete. So I said this is a type of comment. And in this to-do, you can even see, like, let's say that I only want to have the ID portion. I could just say author ID, and now that's the only thing I'll have access to inside these functions. So whenever I come down here to a comment, you can see I have only access to the author ID. So I can limit it however I want. In my case, I just left it as the full comment. And then I can specify a list of all the different actions. So for example, this can only be used with view, create, and update. I don't even have the option to delete comments because that's not something my app can do in this particular use case. Same thing here, we have our to-do, and this one lets us view, create, update, and delete. So we can really fine tune exactly what every single one of our different permissions can do. Then all you have to do is define your permissions. So for example, comments, on the admin, we have true for everything. Same with to-dos, we have true for everything. For our moderator, they can do everything with comments, but with the to-dos, for example, they can view, create, and update any to-do they want, but they can only delete a to-do that's completed. Now this ability right here to do something based on the actual attributes of the object we're doing it on is something that's only possible in this attribute-based access control system. In our old role-based, permission-based system, we had no way to do things based on the attributes of the object. It required us to do these really big checks right here. But now all of that information is defined inside of my permission system. So all my checks are going to go back to incredibly simple checks, and my system for doing my permissions is all handled in this file. Same thing here, when I get to users, it's much more complicated because now I can check for lots of different things. For example, a user can create any comment that they want, but they can only view comments that are not from people that have blocked them. So if one user blocked another one, they no longer can see those comments. They also can update any comment as long as they're the author. If we look at the to-do section, you can see again, they can view any to-do as long as it was not blocked by someone else. So if the user did not block them, they can view it. They can update any to-do where they were the author of it, or any to-do that they've been invited to by another user. And then finally, they can delete any to-do that they have the particular ID of, or if they've been invited by the other user, they can delete it. And they can only delete to-dos that have the completed property set to true. So I'm just doing a bunch of things in here to show you all the flexibility that this has. Obviously, you can do more or less flexibility. It's entirely up to you, but you can pretty much run any JavaScript code you want on your user, your comment, and you can pass in any other information you want inside of here as well. I just have it relatively straightforward, but you can see it's incredibly flexible with what you can do. And then our has permission function right here has changed slightly because now we need to pass it along our user just like before. I broke our resource and our action into 2 separate sections. So now we can pass along, for example, something that looks like this. It'll say has permission. We pass it along our user. We're going to pass it along our resource. and we're going to pass it along the action next. So it's going to be broken into 2 separate parameters. And then finally, if you want, you can actually pass it some data. And this particular data is going to be a comment object. So I can pass along my own comment object as well. So if I don't pass anything along, that's checking, do I have the ability to update every single comment in the database? If I pass along a particular object, that's saying, do I have the ability to update this one particular object? So it's really flexible in how this system is going to work. So to show you a demo of exactly how this happens, I'm going to go back into my code over here. I'm just going to get rid of everything that's in here, paste down a bunch of new code, and I'm going to show you exactly what this code looks like. I also need to make sure up here that I change one of my imports. That'll import from the correct file, make sure everything inside of here is saved. And now if we go back to this particular page, you can see at the very top, I have a list of different to-dos. And I'll make this a little bit wider so you can see exactly what's going on. Zoom it out just a little bit. There we go. So that should be pretty easy for you to see. So I have a list of a bunch of different to-dos, and over here I have them on the right-hand side. So the very first to-do is got an ID of 1. It's by the user with the ID of 1. It's not completed, and there's nobody invited. The ID 2 here, it's also by user number 1. So these first to-dos on the very first row are both by user number 1, and they are either completed or not completed. So there's an X, it means it's not completed. If there's a check mark, it means it is completed. Then finally, the next 2 to-dos are by user number 2, and this final to-do, this very last one, has been invited to by user 1 and 3. So user 1 and 3 are invited to that particular to-do. Then here I'm defining my user. I'm hard coding it for now. We'll implement Clerk in just a little bit, but this is easier for me to play around with what the data is for demonstration purposes. And finally, I have a bunch of different button checks. So I have this general button check, and if we scroll down to that function, you can see all it's doing is calling has permission, passing it my user, passing it my resource, and passing it the action. And if we can perform that action, it's going to give me a blue button, while if I cannot perform that action, it's going to give me a red button. So at the very top here, I'm checking, can I do a view, create, update, and delete on all of the to-dos in my database? This is just a general, can I do this with to-dos? And as you can see, the user with the ID of 3 has a role of user. They are unable to view all of them. They can create any that they want, but they are unable to update all of them, and they're unable to delete all of them. Now, if I were in particular changing this role to admin, and I give this a save, you can now see the admin, everything changes to blue because the admin has permission to do pretty much everything in our application. Then the next thing I'm doing is I'm looping through each to-do, and inside of each to-do, I'm adding 3 separate buttons that check to see if they have permission to view, update, and delete that particular to-do. And if we look at the code for the has permission, you can see it's passing along my user, it's passing along the thing I want to check, which in my case is to-dos, it's passing along the action I want to check, is it view, delete, update, and so on, and finally I'm passing the individual to-do along. So this is going to make sure I do all of those additional checks. So if I go up into here, you can see I pass along my to-do. It's going to call this particular function with all of the code inside of it. So now let's come back into here, and we can really play around with how flexible this permission system is. Because if we come in here and we're going to say we are user with ID of 1, and we give this a quick save, you can see the user with an ID of 1 can view all of these different things. They can view all the to-dos, which is fine because they're not blocked by anybody. They can update the to-dos that they have created themselves. They can delete the to-dos that they've created themselves that are also marked as complete. And you can see here, they've been invited to this particular to-do down here, so they also have the ability to update and delete this to-do. But this to-do by user 2, they did not have permission to do anything on it, so you can see update and delete are blocked out. Now, let's come in here with user 3 instead. You can see user 3 has particular access to this one because they've been invited, but let's say that they've actually been blocked by user 2. If we give this a quick save, you can now see they are prevented from viewing anything that user 2 has created because they are blocked by that user. Same thing here, if we go with user 1, you can see they're prevented from actually viewing any of the information here because they've been blocked by that particular user. Now, if our user has multiple roles, for example, a moderator, we don't want a moderator to be able to be blocked from someone. So if the moderator is the actual role here, you can see they can still view things even if they've been blocked because they're a moderator. They should be able to get around that blocking. That's why we have moderators in the first place. And you can see this particular person has multiple roles. We're checking how multiple roles work. Now, implementing this with Clerk is again relatively straightforward. We just want to make sure we get our session claims again. So we can say const session claims. That's going to be equal to calling the auth function. This is an async function. So make sure we put async right there. We await this. I'm going to get the user ID as well. There we go. And I'll just say here, if our session claims is equal to null, or our user ID is equal to null, then I'm just going to return the button for signing in. So I'll just copy over that button real quick. There we go. Now we have our sign in button. And then finally, what we can do is we can actually get our user. So we can say user is equal to the ID is our user ID, and our roles is your session claims dot roles. There we go. And then we can say that we are blocked by users. What did I call it up here? Blocked by, there we go. And we'll just say they aren't blocked by anyone. You could get that from your database. You could get it from session claims. You can get it from pretty much anywhere you want. But now everything should work just fine with our particular user object. Let's just make sure that we're passing our user everywhere that it needs to be. So what I'm going to do is just take my user. I'm going to pass it along as a prop, just like that, to every single one of these, because we need to have access to that. And same thing here, I'll pass it into my to-do. So we can say this function for to-do is going to take in all of my to-do props, as well as a user. And for now, we'll just type this as any, just so I can get around all the typing stuff. So this is going to be any, and to-do, which is a to-do. And to do that particular typing, as you just come in here, just like that, that'll fix all of those problems. And then same thing here, I'll pass in a user, and I'll just give it the type of any, just so we can get around all the TypeScript stuff, because that's not actually important. Now the last thing I need to do is pass along my user here. There we go. Paste that down. And inside of here, we're going to be passing along a user, again, just with a type of any for now. And I believe I made an error up here. This should not have a type in line. That should fix our problem. And there we go. You can see that this user has the role of user and admin, so they have permission to access everything because they are an admin. But if we want to modify our user to no longer make them an admin, let's remove that admin permission now and give this a quick save. Come back over here, give it a second, and we'll refresh. And now you can see that we are a user. The user ID does not match any of these user IDs, so we can't update or delete any of them. We can view them because we're not blocked by any of these people. I could obviously modify this and say that we are blocked by user 1, and now I can no longer view users 1 stuff, while I can still view users 2 stuff. Now I know I went through the code in this video rather quickly, so if you want to deep dive into any of these permission systems, I'm going to have a link to a GitHub repository that includes all these different permission systems so you can go and tweak them, read them, and see exactly what they're about. Also, if you liked Clerk and you want to check out a really good authentication system that just makes authentication brain dead easy, where you never have to think about it again, highly recommend you check out Clerk. I love using it with my various projects. I'll leave a link in the description down below. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.